Ethan Carter woke to the chill bite of dawn seeping through the threadbare blanket he kept tucked around him like a fragile cocoon. The park was quiet except for the soft patter of drizzle on the bare branches overhead and the slow churn of the river just beyond the bench where he lay. He shifted, stiff joints protesting, when a sound cut through the muted morning, a wet splash, followed by the sharp, stuttering wail of a baby. He jerked upright, heart hammering in his chest, as his eyes darted toward the riverbank. There, at the water's edge, was a tiny figure, a child, no older than 2, dressed in a damp pink onesie, her small hands flailing at the slick mud beneath her. Ethan didn't think. He swung his legs over the bench, boots squelching into the soaked grass as he lunged forward. The cold punched the air from his lungs when he hit the water, but he forced himself on, arms thrashing against the current that tugged at him like icy fingers. The baby gave a strangled cry, slipping forward, and for one breathless moment she vanished beneath the dark, swirling surface. Ethan's chest clenched in panic as he kicked harder, the river closing over his shoulders. He reached out blindly, the water numbing his skin to the bone, until his fingers brushed soft fabric. With a desperate grunt, he seized a fistful of her clothes and hauled her up, turning her tiny face toward the grey sky as she sputtered and gasped. Fighting the river's pull, Ethan dragged them both back toward the bank, his muscles screaming. As his feet sank into the mud, he stumbled onto the shore and collapsed, clutching the baby to his chest, feeling her small body trembling with life against his soaked shirt. His breaths came in ragged clouds that mingled with the morning mist. Then he heard footsteps, frantic, crashing through wet grass, and a cry that cracked the brittle quiet of dawn. A young woman, her hair matted to her tear-streaked face, fell to her knees beside him. "Lily," she sobbed, scooping the baby from his arms. Ethan watched as the child burrowed into her mother's shaking embrace, her cries muffled against Maya's coat. Their eyes met, Maya's wide with terror and gratitude, Ethan's heavy with exhaustion. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words tangled with her sobs. Ethan managed a weak nod. He pushed himself up, legs trembling beneath him, water streaming from his ragged clothes. Without waiting for thanks, without offering his name, he turned and limped away into the dissolving mist. The mother's cries of relief echoing behind him as the drizzle fell like a thin veil between the world and the man who had just saved it. In a way only he would remember, Ethan Carter sat hunched in the shadows behind an abandoned warehouse, the cold gnawing through the layers of damp clothes he hadn't found the strength to peel off. He shivered uncontrollably, coughing so hard it rattled his ribs. In his cracked, dirt-caked hands, he turned over a tiny pink sock, the baby's, which he'd found stuck in his coat pocket after he'd dragged himself from the river. It was absurd, he thought, that something so small could feel heavier than all the other burdens he carried. 4 years ago, he'd had a house with warm light in the windows, a wife who used to rub his shoulders after long shifts, and a little boy who would leap into his arms the moment he walked through the door. Back then, he'd been a foreman on a construction crew, trusted with men's safety and livelihoods. But one mistake, a loose scaffolding plank, no one had checked twice, took a young worker's life and left. Ethan staring down lawyers, courtrooms, and the icy rage in his wife's eyes. The bottle had been easier than facing any of it, easier than apologies, easier than waking up every morning and seeing the hollow look on his son's face. When the jobs dried up, so did the last of his excuses. His wife packed a moving truck while he sat on the front steps, the papers she'd filed fluttering in her hands. She drove away with their boy asleep in the back seat and never looked back. Now the streets were his home, a bench here, a hidden, cornered there, his pillow, a folded jacket, his dinner, whatever scraps he could scrounge, or someone kind enough to share. He did odd jobs when he could, fixing fences, hauling trash, patching roofs until someone realized he didn't have a real address or a phone number. and the work dried up again. He had learned how to disappear in plain sight, how to make himself small and quiet so that the world kept moving without him. But now, cradling that tiny sock in his palm, Ethan wondered if maybe the man he used to be wasn't entirely dead. Across town, Maya Thompson sat at her kitchen table in a cramped, peeling apartment that smelled faintly of stale coffee and baby powder. Her hands trembled as she pressed a fresh flyer against the tabletop, smoothing out the wrinkles. The headline read, "Seeking Hero, please help me find him." Underneath a blurry sketch, her best guess at the man's scruffy face, kind eyes, shaggy hair, wet and dripping, and a brief plea. He'd saved her baby's life when she'd been seconds too late. She'd printed a dozen copies with the last of her ink and tacked them up at the diner, the laundromat, the bus stops, anywhere someone might know the man who vanished into the mist that cold morning. Sleep was a stranger to Maya these days. Her nights blurred into early dawns at the 24-hour diner, where she poured coffee for truckers and students who never noticed how her eyes drifted shut if she stood still too long. Her days disappeared under humming dryers and baskets of clothes that weren't hers. When Lily slipped out that morning, when Maya jolted awake to an open door and an empty crib, she'd run barefoot through the hallway and down 3 flights of creaking stairs before her mind could catch up to her pounding heart. By the time she saw that stranger on the riverbank, soaked and shaking beside her daughter, she felt her world collapse and knit itself back together all at once. She should have thanked him properly, gotten his name, pressed a warm cup of coffee into his cold hands, given him a dry blanket, something. But she hadn't. He was gone before she could speak. Now, every time Lily babbled at her toys or tugged on her shirt for another cracker, Maya's chest tightened with a gratitude that had nowhere to go. She owed that man more than she could ever repay. While Maya pinned another flyer to a cracked lamppost near the bus stop, Ethan curled deeper into his damp blanket, sock clutched tight to his chest. He knew his cough was getting worse. He could feel it burning in his bones. But for once, he didn't reach for the bottle hidden beneath the tarp beside him. Instead, he closed his eyes and imagined a little boy's giggle, the way his son's small arms had once wrapped around his neck, how it felt to be needed, to be good. Maybe he'd fade away in this cold corner, just another lost soul the city stepped over. Or maybe, just maybe, this tiny sock meant he hadn't drifted so far from himself that he couldn't find a way back. He held on to that thought like a spark against the damp darkness pressing in from every side, not knowing that somewhere in the city, a young mother he'd never see coming was searching for him, the man who'd saved her baby, and maybe, in some hidden place inside him, had saved himself too. The story of the baby rescued from the river spread faster than Maya could have imagined. Someone at the diner must have snapped a picture of one of her flyers and sent it to the local news station. Within a day, the headline was everywhere. Asterisk, homeless hero saves baby girl from drowning. A blurry image of her sketch flickered on TV screens behind anchors in polished suits. The same story playing on repeat. A nameless drifter who'd risked his life for a stranger's child and vanished before anyone could thank him. Volunteers from the nearby church started asking around the park, the shelter, the soup kitchen line that snaked down the block every evening. They held up printouts of the same drawing Maya had done at her kitchen table, her hands still stained with dish soap and worry. Some people claimed they'd seen him. Others shrugged and moved on. But Maya didn't give up. Every evening, after her shift at the diner, she bundled Lily into her coat and walked the streets near the shelter, peering through crowds of weathered faces and hunched shoulders, hoping for a glimpse of those tired eyes she couldn't forget. It was just past dusk when she finally saw him. He was standing at the back of the soup kitchen line, shoulders hunched, head lowered against the drizzle that never seemed to leave this part of town. His hair was plastered to his forehead, his clothes hung off him in damp folds, and he looked so much smaller than he had in her mind. For a heartbeat, Maya almost turned away, afraid that up close he might not be the man she'd built up in her thoughts. But Lily squirmed in her arms and let out a soft, questioning whimper, and Maya stepped forward before she could lose her nerve. "Ethan," she said, her voice trembling as she pushed through the line toward him. He looked up, startled, and for a moment she wasn't sure he'd recognize her at all. But then his eyes flicked to the baby in her arms, her little hand gripping Maya's collar, and something in his face cracked open. A flash of that same quiet, desperate courage she'd seen on the riverbank. "I don't know you," he mumbled, ducking his head, trying to step away. The people around them shifted, grumbled, but gave them space as Maya reached for his arm. "Please, don't go," she said. "I've been looking for you. You saved my baby. You saved me." She could see him recoil at her words, like praise was something sharp that might cut him. "It was nothing," he rasped, coughing into his sleeve. Up close, she could smell the river still clinging to him beneath the sourness of sweat and damp cardboard. He tried to shrug her off. "I don't want anything, okay? Just let me be." "It wasn't nothing," Maya said fiercely, tightening her grip on Lily as the child reached a chubby hand toward Ethan's coat. "You nearly drowned for her. Please, just come inside. Get warm, get something to eat. I'm fine." The lie hung limp in the cold air. Ethan's eyes darted to the steam rising from the kitchen door, the smell of hot soup drifting out to meet them. But then he looked back at Maya, at the baby who squealed his name in her own babbled way, and the fight drained out of him. He still refused to move. So Maya dug into her pocket, pulled out a battered napkin and a pen. She'd swiped from the diner that morning. She scribbled her name and number, hands shaking from the chill. She pressed it into his palm and curled his fingers around it before he could protest. "If you ever need anything, anything at all, you call me," she said. Her eyes searched his face, but he wouldn't look at her. He stared at the napkin like it was a live wire. "I mean it, please." Ethan just nodded, too choked to speak, the line behind him inching forward. Maya stepped back, pressing a kiss to Lily's head, and watched him shuffle inside the shelter. The scrap of napkin clenched so tightly in his hand it might as well have been a lifeline. That night, Ethan lay curled in the shadows of the warehouse again, the baby sock tucked in one pocket, the napkin in the other. His cough rattled through the silence like a death knell, his fever boiling away whatever warmth he'd taken from that short time indoors. He turned the napkin over and over in the dark, the numbers smudged from the dampness of his palm. He told himself he should throw it away, that he had no right to call someone like her, to drag his ruin into her fragile world. But as the night closed in, Ethan kept the napkin pressed to his chest, wondering what it might feel like, just once, to let himself believe he deserved to be saved, to dot the fever finally did what the icy river and sleepless nights hadn't. It dropped Ethan to his knees outside the shelter door just as dawn bled pale light over the city rooftops. He felt the world tilt and narrow, the sidewalk rising to meet him in a cold, rough embrace. The last thing he saw before darkness swallowed him was the blurry outline of Reverend Harris, the sturdy old man who ran the soup line and never failed to greet Ethan with a warm smile and a gentle word, no matter how ragged he looked. When Ethan came to, the stale hum of fluorescent lights replaced the bite of the street's cold. His body ached in ways he couldn't place, and his head throbbed like a punishment he deserved. He tried to sit up, but a gentle weight pressed him back, Maya's hand steady on his chest, her eyes bloodshot with worry as she balanced Lily on her lap, the baby's head tucked against her shoulder, small mouth slack with sleep. "You scared me half to death," she whispered, voice raw but warm. She brushed a stray lock of hair from Lily's forehead and looked at Ethan like he was something fragile that might break if she let go. Ethan tried to pull away, mortified at the thought of her seeing him like this, unshaven, shivering in a borrowed blanket, an ivy taped to his arm like he was someone worth saving. "I shouldn't be here," he rasped, throat raw. He swung his legs off the narrow cot, but found his strength gone, the room spinning before his feet could even touch the floor. "I don't belong here. I'm fine. Just let me go." "You're not fine," Maya shot back, her hand tightening on his. "You were burning up. Reverend Harris found my number in your pocket. That napkin. You kept it." Her eyes softened, searching his face for cracks he'd spent years learning to hide. "Please, Ethan, just rest. For me, for Lily." Her daughter stirred then, tiny fingers opening and closing in the air until they found the scratchy edge of Ethan's blanket. The touch rooted him in place more than Maya's words ever could. He sank back against the pillow, staring at the ceiling as shame burned hotter than the fever ever had. Over the next few days, in that cramped clinic room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and stale coffee, Ethan's story trickled out in stops and starts. How he'd once worn a hard hat and a foreman's vest, barking orders that built other people's dreams. How a single slip, a loose plank, an oversight, cost a young man his life, and Ethan everything else. He talked about the whiskey that drowned his guilt, the fights with his wife that hollowed out their home, until she packed up their boy and vanished down an interstate Ethan had never managed to follow. He didn't cry when he spoke, didn't apologize for the raw edges of his words. He just told it plain, like penance. Maya listened to every word, never interrupting, never flinching away from the worst of it. When he finished, she reached across the narrow bed and squeezed his hand. No judgment, no pity either. Just a quiet truth shining in her tired eyes. Asterisk, you're still here. You still matter. Asterisk, when the clinic finally discharged him with a faded coat and a bag of antibiotics, Reverend Harris had scrounged from the free pharmacy. Maya was waiting by the door, with Lily bouncing on her hip and a cab idling at the curb. She didn't ask if he wanted to come with her. She just told him, "You're coming home with us." Ethan opened his mouth to argue, his pride rearing up to shield him from the shame of accepting what he didn't feel he deserved. But then Lily reached out, her tiny hand patting his cheek as she babbled something that sounded suspiciously like "thank you." He'd heard those words in her mother's voice 100 times, but hearing them from the little life he'd pulled from the river made something in him crack wide open. He climbed into the cab without another word. Maya's apartment was smaller than he'd imagined. A faded couch pushed up against a drafty window, toys scattered like breadcrumbs across a tired carpet. She cleared a space for him without hesitation, plumping a pillow that had seen better days, handing him an old quilt that smelled faintly of lavender and baby shampoo. At first, Ethan perched on the edge of the couch like he might spring for the door at any moment. He could feel the whispers through the thin walls, neighbors peeking through cracked doors, the landlord's threat echoing down the hallway. Asterisk, you can't just bring strays in here. Maya, you're putting the building at risk. She'd met that threat with a flat stare and slammed her door so hard the frame rattled. But the tension lingered, judgment in the sideways glances when she lugged groceries up the stairs, the muffled gossip that paused when Ethan's ragged coughs echoed through the hall at night. He tried to tell himself he wouldn't stay long, that he'd leave the moment he was strong enough, that he wouldn't weigh down the only good thing he'd touched in years. But every time he shifted toward the door, some small tether pulled him back, Lily giggling as she climbed over his legs, babbling her made-up words while she pressed her tiny socks into his hands like offerings. Maya, catching him staring at the floor, her voice soft but firm. Asterisk, you're not a burden, Ethan. You're family now, whether you like it or not. Asterisk, one night, when the clock on Maya's microwave blinked 2 a.m. in tired green digits, Ethan couldn't stand it anymore. He gathered what little he had, a threadbare coat, the baby sock he still kept tucked in his pocket, and eased the door open as quietly as he could. But before he could slip into the hallway, A soft voice cut through the dark. "Where are you going?" Maya stood in the kitchen doorway, hair wild from sleep, Lily's blanket still draped over her shoulder. Ethan froze, shame crawling up his spine as he turned to face her. "I can't stay," he whispered. "You're risking too much for me. People talk. Your landlord's ready to throw you out. I can't. I won't be the reason you and Lily lose your home." Maya stepped forward until she could place her hand against his cheek, just like her daughter did. "Lily sleeps better when you're here," she said softly, her eyes shining in the dim light. "She feels safe." "So do I." She didn't order him to stay. She didn't beg either. She just stood there, her hand warm against the cold skin of a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to be wanted. After a heartbeat, Ethan's shoulders sagged, the tension slipping from his frame as he let the door drift shut behind him. He sank back onto the couch, the old quilt pulled around his shoulders, and listened to the sound of Lily's soft breathing from the bedroom. For the first time in years, Ethan Carter let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, home was still a place he could belong. The knock on the door came late on a Saturday, loud enough to rattle the thin walls of Maya's apartment and wake Lily from her nap with a startled wail. Maya froze halfway to the sink, a dripping mug in her hand, her heart thudding in her throat. She hadn't seen Jordan in over 2 years, not since he'd slammed the door behind him and left her alone in a cold hospital room with a newborn in her arms and no idea how she'd pay the bills he'd abandoned. But when she opened the door and saw him standing there, hair slicked back, grin too wide to be real, it was like no time had passed at all. "Hey May." Jordan's voice was oily smooth, fake warmth dripping from every syllable. "Long time, huh? I saw the news. My little girl's famous, huh? Hero baby and all that." He tried to peer past her shoulder, but Maya stepped forward, blocking the doorway with her body. "You don't get to just show up here," she hissed, keeping her voice low for Lily's sake. "What do you want, Jordan?" He laughed, a sharp bark that made Maya's skin crawl. "Relax. I just want to see my kid. She's mine too, you know. And all these people talking about you, about some homeless bum crashing on your couch. What would they think, huh? Maybe CPS should hear about it. Unsafe environment for a baby girl. I mean, come on, Maya. You really think they'd leave her with you once they know who you're letting live here?" The threat sliced through her like a blade. She opened her mouth to tell him to leave, to scream if she had to, but a shadow moved in the hallway behind her. Ethan, drawn by the raised voices, his gaunt frame filling the narrow doorway. He took in the scene, Jordan's mocking smirk, Maya's trembling hands, Lily's muffled cries from the bedroom, and something old and fierce flickered to life behind his tired eyes. "You need to leave," Ethan said, his voice low, steady in a way Maya hadn't heard before. He stepped between them without hesitation, planting himself like a shield. Jordan scoffed, eyes flicking over Ethan's patched jacket and battered shoes. "Oh, look at this. The stray thinks he's a guard dog now. Get out of my face, old man." Before he could finish, Ethan stepped closer, close enough that Jordan's grin faltered. "You heard her," Ethan growled, his voice raw with something deeper than anger, the same desperate protectiveness that had sent him into that freezing river. "You don't get to scare her. You don't get to hurt them. Not anymore." The tension snapped like a frayed wire. Jordan shoved Ethan back, spit flying as he snarled, "Who the hell do you think you are? You think you can just..." His fist came up fast, a wild, sloppy punch that caught Ethan on the cheekbone. Pain burst behind Ethan's eyes, but he didn't fall. He surged forward instead, ramming his shoulder into Jordan's chest, driving him back into the doorframe with a thud that shook the whole apartment. They grappled, fists swinging in, clumsy arcs, years of resentment and helplessness spilling out with every blow. Maya shouted for them to stop, her voice drowned by the scuffle, the baby's wails rising into a sharp, terrified shriek. Doors opened up and down the hallway, neighbors poking their heads out just in time to see Ethan shove Jordan into the cracked plaster wall. Jordan swung again, caught Ethan in the ribs, but Ethan held on. His fingers knotted in the front of Jordan's fancy jacket until the front buttons popped loose. It might have gone on longer if Reverend Harris hadn't appeared, summoned by the commotion. The old man wedged himself between them with surprising strength, pushing Ethan back as two neighbors grabbed Jordan's arms and pinned him to the wall. Someone called the police, the wail of sirens echoing down the block moments later. When the officers arrived, Jordan tried to spin his story, wild gestures and half-truths spilling from his mouth about intruders and unsafe conditions. But Maya's voice cut through it all clear, shaking but unbroken as she told the officers exactly who Jordan was and exactly what he'd threatened to do. With Reverend Harris standing beside her like a stone wall, she pressed charges then and there, filed for a restraining order the same afternoon, her hands trembling only once as she signed her name on the paper that would keep Jordan out of their lives for good. When the door finally clicked shut behind the last uniformed officer, Ethan sat slumped on the couch, a bag of frozen peas pressed to his bruised jaw. He wouldn't meet Maya's eyes, too busy staring at the floor like it might open up and swallow him whole. "I ruined everything," he croaked when she sat beside him. "I brought all this trouble to your door. You and Lily, you'd be better off if I'd just..." Maya cut him off with a sharp shake of her head. She reached for his battered hand, folding her smaller fingers around his knuckles. "Don't you dare," she said fiercely. "You didn't ruin anything, Ethan. You stood up for us. You made me see that I don't have to be afraid anymore. I can fight back, because of you." He looked up then, eyes glassy, mouth opening to argue, but she pressed her palm to his cheek, gentle over the swelling where Jordan's fist had landed. Lily toddled out of the bedroom then, clutching her favorite stuffed bunny, her tear-swollen eyes lighting up when she saw Ethan. She climbed onto his lap without hesitation, curling against his chest with a sleepy mumble of "thank you," her tiny voice muffled by his shirt. Maya watched them, her heart so full it hurt. "Your family, Ethan," she whispered. "Ours, whether you believe it or not." In that battered living room, with Lily breathing soft warmth against his ribs and Maya's hand steady on his shoulder, Ethan Carter let himself believe it, just for a moment, that maybe family wasn't something you lost forever. Maybe, if you were lucky, it was something you could find again. Spring crept into the city like a shy promise, coaxing pale green buds from the gnarled branches. In the park where Ethan had once woken alone on a rain-soaked bench, now he stood there again, but not alone this time. Maya beside him, Lily perched on his hip, squealing at the pigeons that pecked at the crumbs Ethan tossed with a grin that still felt foreign on his face, like trying on a coat he hadn't worn in years. Things hadn't magically fixed themselves overnight. The bruises from Jordan's visit had faded faster than the whispers in Maya's hallway, but with Reverend Harris's steady voice guiding them through courthouse lines and city offices, Ethan finally got a battered state ID in his hand, a little laminated proof that he was still somebody, still real, still worth counting. Maya was there when they found Tyler's college in a dusty online search, a small state school 2 time zones away. She sat with Ethan at the battered kitchen table while he scratched out draft after draft of a letter on a stack of donated printer paper. Each word was a minefield. Asterisk, "I'm sorry, I was wrong. I never stopped loving you." Asterisk, he tore up more pages. Then he kept, hands trembling every time Lily toddled over to tug at his sleeve, reminding him of the second chance he'd stumbled into. When he finally sealed the envelope, shaking so badly Maya pressed her warm palm over his, he felt like he'd just handed over a piece of his heart. trusting a thin white stamp to carry it to a boy who might never want to see him again. While they waited, life moved forward in small, stubborn steps. Reverend Harris found him odd jobs through the church network, mopping floors at the rec center, hauling broken chairs out of the Sunday schoolroom, patching leaks in a crumbling basement where the soup kitchen kept its boxes of donated food. The pay was pocket change, but Ethan tucked every spare bill into a battered envelope under Maya's sink, watching it grow enough to imagine a place of his own someday, not far, just a room with 4 walls and a door that locked. Some nights he lay awake on Maya's couch, staring at the ceiling, repeating the address of the community center where he now went every Thursday, a warm room of folding chairs and stale coffee, where he stood up once a week and said out loud, "I'm Ethan. I'm an alcoholic, but I'm trying." His shoulders sat straighter these days. The tremor in his hands faded with the liquor he no longer reached for. When Lily ran at him full tilt, squealing his name in her garbled baby talk, he didn't flinch away from her sticky fingers. He scooped her up, breathing in the simple sweetness of her hair, letting the warmth of her laugh push back the old ghosts that still lingered at the edges of sleep. Then, one evening, as twilight poured gold through Maya's cracked blinds, he found the letter waiting on the little table by the door, his name scribbled on the front in a handwriting he didn't recognize but felt in his bones. His breath hitched as he sank onto the couch, his fingers fumbling with the flap. Maya knelt beside him, her hand braced over his knee, her eyes locked on his. He read Tyler's words aloud in a hoarse whisper, an awkward tangle of careful sentences. "I got your letter. I think I'd like to see you. I don't know what to say yet, but maybe we can talk." Ethan read it twice, 3 times, the words blurring as tears filled his eyes. Lily crawled up between them, oblivious to the trembling in his chest, giggling as she tugged at Maya's hair and shoved a toy truck at Ethan's chest like an offering. He wrapped an arm around Maya's shoulders, the letter shaking in his other hand. He looked at her, at the woman who'd found him when he was lost, who'd dragged him back from the edge, not with pity but with stubborn, unyielding faith, and for the first time, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter than the hope blooming in his ribs. "You're not alone anymore," Maya whispered, pressing her forehead to his, her voice thick with tears that matched his own. Ethan's throat worked around the lump of gratitude and fear, and something else, something like love, that pulsed in his chest as he kissed the top of Lily's head and let the letter slip to the floor. His voice cracked on the truth he hadn't believed he'd ever get to say again. "Neither are you," he breathed, his arms pulling them both closer as the last light of day faded, leaving only the warm glow of the tiny apartment that, for the first time in far too long, felt like home. The morning bus station is all bright sun and the low hiss of brakes as Ethan stands with his ticket clutched in his clean, trembling hand. He shaved for the first time in years, his face raw and unfamiliar in the reflection of the grimy station window. The second-hand jacket Reverend Harris found him fits a little loose around the shoulders, but it makes him feel almost like the man he used to be, or maybe a man he's becoming, piece by fragile piece. Maya stands beside him, Lily perched on her hip, her tiny shoes tapping against Maya's side as she babbles nonsense and reaches for Ethan's hair. When the call for his bus echoes through the waiting area, Ethan kneels down on the cold concrete, gathers Lily into his arms, and buries his face in her soft curls. She squeals at his stubbly cheek, plants a wet, open-mouthed kiss near his ear, and giggles when he laughs, a real, quiet laugh that feels like it shakes the dust off his ribs when he stands. Maya's there, her eyes shining as she pulls him into a fierce hug that smells like cheap soap and the baby powder clinging to Lily's clothes. "You didn't have to do any of this for me," he murmurs, voice cracking like old timber. But Maya shakes her head, presses her hand flat over his chest like she's steadying his heartbeat. "You saved us. she whispers, and we saved you right back. That's how it works. When the driver waves him forward, Ethan forces himself to let go. One last squeeze of Maya's shoulder, one last kiss to Lily's tiny fist. He climbs the steps, finds a window seat near the back. As the bus rumbles to life, he presses his palm to the glass and watches them, Maya with her arm around Lily's shoulders, both of them waving, two small silhouettes that feel bigger than anything he's leaving behind. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out the tiny baby sock, the one he'd found tangled in his coat that cold morning by the river. He turns it over in his hand, feeling the softness, the smallness, the reminder that even people as broken as him could pull someone else from the dark and be pulled out themselves. As the city blurs past the window, Ethan smiles, a real smile, wide and unguarded, the first in years, and maybe the first of many more.